Greetings, welcome back to Black Bear News, where we are discussing abrupt climate change. Hold on to your hats, folks. I'm going to read more of this Losing Earth article. I kind of didn't know what I was biting into when I said I was going to read the whole thing. It may actually take me a couple of, maybe couple meaning more than two, a few episodes to read this whole thing. It is so long, but I hope you find it entertaining, informative. Hopefully my reading of it is not too broken up by my own inabilities to speak, but we're just going to dive right in. It's another hot day. Just quickly say it's just continues to be warm as heck here in Los Angeles, well into the hundreds and continuing through the week, it looks like. Thank you all for your comments. Some really great comments yesterday. I try to look at every single one and respond to as many as I can. Forgive me if I don't. I'm going to read, I'm going to pick up with the last chapter I read yesterday from Losing Earth. Let me get the whole title is Losing Earth, the Decade We Almost Stopped Climate Change. This is from the New York Times from this weekend, or this week. In 1974, the CIA issued a classified report on the carbon dioxide problem that concluded that climate change had begun around 1960 and had already caused major economic problems throughout the world. The future economic and political impacts would be almost beyond comprehension, yet emissions continued to rise, and at this rate, McDonald warned, they could see a snowless New England, the swamping of major coastal cities, as much as 40% decline in national wheat production, the forced migration of about 1/4 of the world's population, not within centuries, within our lifetimes. What would you have us do? Press asked. The president's plan, in the wake of the Saudi oil crisis, to promote solar energy. He had gone so far as to install 32 solar panels on the roof of the White House to heat his family's water. Was a good start, McDonald thought. But Jimmy Carter's plan to stimulate production of synthetic fuels, gas and liquid fuel extracted from shale and tar sands was a dangerous idea. Nuclear power, despite the recent tragedy at 3 Mile Island, should be expanded. But even natural gas and ethanol were preferable to coal. There was no way around it. Coal production would ultimately have to end. The president's advisors asked respectful questions, but Pomerantz couldn't tell whether they were persuaded. The men all stood and shook hands, and press led McDonald and Pomerantz out of his office. After they emerged from the old executive office building into Pennsylvania Avenue, Pomerantz asked McDonald what he thought would happen. Knowing Frank as I do, McDonald said, I really couldn't tell you. In the days that followed, Pomerantz grew uneasy. Until this point, he had fixated on the science of the carbon dioxide issue and its possible political ramifications. But now that his meetings on Capitol Hill had concluded, he began to question what all this might mean for his own future. His wife, Lenore, was 8 months pregnant. Was it ethical, he wondered, to bring a child onto a planet that would, before much longer, become inhospitable to life? And he wondered why it had fallen to him, a 32-year-old lobbyist without scientific training, to bring greater attention to this crisis. Finally, weeks later, McDonald called to tell him that press had taken up the issue. On May 22nd, Press wrote a letter to the president of the National Academy of Sciences requesting a full assessment of the carbon dioxide issue. Jules Charney, the father of modern meteorology, would gather the nation's top oceanographers, atmospheric scientists, and climate modelers to judge whether McDonald's alarm was justified, whether the world was, in fact, headed to cataclysm. Pomerantz was amazed by how much momentum had built in such a short time. Scientists at the highest levels of government had known about the dangers of fossil fuel combustion for decades. Yet they had produced little besides journal articles, academic symposiums, technical reports. Nor had any politician, journalist, or activist championed the issue. That, Pomerantz figured, was about to change. If Charney's group confirmed that the world was careening toward an existential crisis, the president would be forced to act. There's a crazy picture of the Hurricane Harvey floods struck Texas last year. 2, the whimsies of the invisible world. Spring 1979. There was a brown velvet love seat in the living room of James and Aniek Hansen under a bright window looking out on Morningside Park in Manhattan that nobody ever sat in. Eric, their 2-year-old son, was forbidden to go near it. The ceiling above the couch sagged ominously as if pregnant with some alien life form, and the bulge grew with each passing week. Jim promised Aniek that he would fix it, which was only fair because it had been on his insistence that they gave up the prospect of a pre-war apartment in Scoyton-Duville overlooking the Hudson and moved from Riverdale to this 2-story walk-up with crumbling walls, police siren lullabies, and gravid ceiling. Jim had resented the 45-minute commute to NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies in Manhattan and complained that such a gross waste of time would soon be unsustainable once the Pioneer spacecraft reached Venus and began to beam back data. But even after the Hansens moved within a few blocks of the Institute, Jim couldn't make time for the ceiling. And after 4 months, it finally burst, releasing a confetti of browned pipes and splintered wood. Jim repeated his vow to fix the ceiling as soon as he had a moment free from work. Aniek held him to his word, though it required her to live with a hole in her ceiling until Thanksgiving, 7 months of plaster dust powdering the love seat. Another promise Jim made to Aniek. He would make it home for dinner every night by 7 p.m. By 8:30, however, he was back at his calculations. Aniek did not begrudge him his deep commitment to his work. It was one of the things she loved about him. Still, it baffled her that the subject of his obsession should be the atmospheric conditions of a planet more than 24 million miles away. It baffled Jim, too. His voyage to Venus from Denison, Iowa, the 5th child of a diner waitress and an itinerant farmer turned bartender, had been a series of bizarre twists of fate over which he claimed no agency. It was just something that happened to him. Hansen figured that he was the only scientist at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration who, as a child, did not dream of outer space. He dreamed only of baseball. On clear nights, his transistor radio picked up the broadcast of the Kansas City Blues, the New York Yankees' AAA affiliate. Every morning he cut out the box scores, pasted them into a notebook, and tallied statistics. Hansen found comfort in numbers and equations. He majored in math and physics at the University of Iowa, but he never would have taken an interest in celestial matters were it not for the unlikely coincidence of 2 events during the year he graduated: the eruption of a volcano in Bali and a total eclipse of the moon. On the night of December 3rd, 1963, whipping wind, 12 degrees below zero, Hansen accompanied his astronomy professor to a cornfield far from town. They set up a telescope in an old corn crib, and between 2 and 8 in the morning made continuous photoelectric recordings of the eclipse, pausing only when the extension cord froze and when they dashed to the car for a few minutes to avoid frostbite. During an eclipse, the moon resembles a tangerine, or if the eclipse is total, a drop of blood. But this night, the moon vanished altogether. Hansen made the mystery the subject of his master's thesis, concluding that the moon had been obscured by the dust erupted into the atmosphere by Mount Agung on the other side of the planet from his corn crib 6 months earlier. The discovery led to his fascination with the influence of invisible particles on the visible world. You could not make sense of the visible world until you understood the whimsies of the invisible one. One of the leading authorities on the invisible world happened to be teaching then at Iowa. James Van Allen made the first major discovery of the space age, identifying the 2 donut-shaped regions of convulsing particles that circle the Earth, now known as the Van Allen belts. At Van Allen's prodding, Hansen turned from the moon to Venus. Why? he tried to determine, was its surface so hot? In 1967, a Soviet satellite beamed back the answer. The planet's atmosphere was mainly carbon dioxide. Though once it may have had habitable temperatures, it was believed to have succumbed to a runaway greenhouse effect. As the sun grew brighter, Venus's oceans began to evaporate, thickening the atmosphere, which forced yet greater evaporation, a self-perpetuating cycle that finally boiled off the ocean entirely and heated the planet's surface to more than 800 degrees Fahrenheit. At the other extreme, Mars's thin atmosphere had insufficient carbon dioxide to trap much heat at all, leaving it about 900 degrees colder. Earth lay in the middle, its Goldilocks greenhouse effect just strong enough to support life. Aniak expected Jim's professional life to resume some semblance of normality once the data from Venus had been collected and analyzed. But shortly after Pioneer entered Venus's atmosphere, Hansen came home from the office in an uncharacteristic fervor with an apology. The prospect of 2 or 3 more years of intense work had sprung up before him. NASA was expanding its study of Earth's atmospheric conditions. Hansen had already done some work on Earth's atmosphere for Jules Charney at the Goddard Institute, helping to develop computerized weather models. Now Hansen would have an opportunity to apply to Earth the lessons he had learned from Venus. We want to learn more about Earth's climate, Jim told Aniak, and how humanity can influence it. He could use giant new supercomputers to map the planet's atmosphere. They would create mirror worlds, parallel realities that mimicked our own. These digital simulacra, technically called general circulation models, combined the mathematical formulas that govern the behavior of the sea, land, and sky into a single computer model. Unlike the real world, they can be sped forward to reveal the future. Aniak's disappointment, another several years of distraction, stress, time spent apart from the family, was tempered, if only slightly, by the high strain of Jim's enthusiasm. She thought she understood it. Does this mean, she asked, that you'll be able to predict weather more accurately? Yes, Jim said, something like that. 3, between catastrophe and chaos, July 1979. The scientists summoned by Jules Charney to judge the fate of civilization arrived on July 23, 1979, with their wives, children, and weekend bags at a 3-story mansion in Woods Hole on the southwestern spur of Cape Cod. They would review all the available science and decide whether the White House should take seriously Gordon MacDonald's prediction of a climate apocalypse. The Jasons had predicted a warming of 2 or 3 degrees Celsius by the middle of the 21st century. Wow. Pretty spot on. But like Roger Revelle, hold on. But like Roger Revelle before them, they emphasized their reasons for uncertainty. Charney scientists were asked to quantify that uncertainty. They had to get it right. Their conclusion would be delivered to the president, but first they would hold a clam bake. They gathered with their families on a bluff overlooking Quisette Harbor and took turns tossing mesh produce bags stuffed with lobster, clams, and corn into a bubbling cauldron. While the children scrambled across the rolling lawn, the scientists mingled with a clack of visiting dignitaries whose status lay somewhere between chaperone and client. Men from the Departments of State, Energy, Defense, and Agriculture, the EPA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They exchanged pleasantries and took in the sunset. It was a hot day, high 80s, but the harbor breeze was salty and cool. It didn't look like the dawning of an apocalypse. The government officials, many of them scientists themselves, tried to suppress their awe of the legends in their presence. Henry Stommel, the world's leading oceanographer, his protege, Carl Wunsch, a Jason, the Manhattan Project alumnus Cecil Leith, the Harvard planetary physicist Richard Goody. These were the men who, in the last 3 decades, had discovered foundational principles underlying the relationships among the sun, atmosphere, land, and ocean, which is to say, the climate. The hierarchy was made visible during the workshop sessions held in the carriage house next door. The scientists sat at tables arranged in a rectangle, while their federal observers sat along the room's perimeter, taking in the action as at a theater in the round. The first 2 days of meetings didn't make very good theater, however, as the scientists reviewed the basic principles of the carbon cycle, ocean circulation, radiative transfer. On the third day, Charney introduced a new prop, a black speaker attached to a telephone. He dialed, and Jim Hansen answered. Charney called Hansen because he had grasped that in order to determine the exact range of future warming, his group would have to venture into the realm of the mirror worlds. Jules Charney himself had used a general circulation model to revolutionize weather prediction. But Hansen was one of just a few modelers who had studied the effects of carbon emissions. When, at Charney's request, Hansen programmed his model to consider a future of doubled carbon dioxide, it predicted a temperature increase of 4 degrees Celsius. That was twice as much warming as the prediction made by the most prominent climate modeler, Syukuro Manabe, whose government lab at Princeton was the first to model the greenhouse effect. The difference between the two predictions, between warming of 2 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius, was the difference between damaged coral reefs and no reefs whatsoever, between thinning forests and forests enveloped by desert, between catastrophe and chaos. In the carriage house, the disembodied voice of Jim Hansen explained in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone how his model weighed the influences of clouds, oceans, and snow on warming. The older scientists interrupted, shouting questions. When they did not transmit through the telephone, Charney repeated them in a bellow. The questions kept coming, often before the younger respondent could finish his answers, and Hansen wondered if it wouldn't have been easier for him to drive the 5 hours and meet with them in person. Among Charney's group was Akio Arakawa, a pioneer of computer modeling. On the final night at Woods Hole, Arakawa stayed up in his motel room with printouts from the models by Hansen and Manabe, blanketing his double bed. The discrepancy between the models, Arakawa concluded, came down to ice and snow. The whiteness of the world's snowfields reflected light. If snow melted in a warmer climate, less radiation would escape the atmosphere, leading to even greater warming. Shortly before dawn, Arakawa concluded that Manabe had given too little weight to the influence of melting sea ice, while Hansen had overemphasized it. The best estimate lay in between, which meant that the Jason's calculation was too optimistic. When carbon dioxide doubled in 2035 or thereabouts, global temperatures would increase between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius, with the most likely outcome a warming of 3 degrees. Wow, how spot on is that? That's pretty amazing, considering they knew this in the late 70s, and, you know, the Paris Agreement, which happened 30 years later, was talking about, we got to hold it to 1.5 or whatever. The publication of Jules Charney's report, Carbon Dioxide and Climate, a Scientific Assessment, several months later was not accompanied by a banquet, a parade, or even a news conference. Yet within the highest levels of the federal government, the scientific community, and the oil and gas industry within the Commonwealth of people who had begun to concern themselves with the future habitability of the planet, the Charney report would come to have the authority of a settled fact. It was the summation of all the predictions that had come before it, and it would withstand the scrutiny of the decades that followed it. Charney's group had considered everything known about ocean, sun, sea, air, and fossil fuels, and it had distilled it into a single number, 3. When the doubling threshold was broached, as appeared inevitable, the world would warm 3 degrees Celsius. The last time the world was 3 degrees warmer was during the Pliocene, 3 million years ago, when beech trees grew in Antarctica. The seas were 80 feet higher, and horses galloped across the Canadian coast of the Arctic Ocean. The Charney report left Jim Hansen with more urgent questions. 3 degrees would be nightmarish, and unless carbon emissions ceased suddenly, 3 degrees would only be the beginning. The real question was whether the warming trend could be reversed. Was there time to act? And how would a global commitment to cease burning fossil fuels come about exactly? Who had the power to make such a thing happen? Hansen didn't know how to begin to answer these questions, but he would learn. 4. A very aggressive defensive program. Summer 1979 to summer 1980. After the publication of the Charney report, Exxon decided to create its own dedicated carbon dioxide research program with an annual budget of $600,000. Only Exxon was asking a slightly different question than Jules Charney. Exxon didn't concern itself primarily with how much the world would warm. It wanted to know how much of the warming Exxon could be blamed for. A senior researcher named Henry Shaw had argued that the company needed a deeper understanding of the issue in order to influence future legislation that might restrict carbon dioxide emissions. It behooves us to start a very aggressive defensive program, Shaw wrote in a memo to a manager, because there is a good probability that legislation affecting our business will be passed. Shaw turned to Wallace Broecker, a Columbia University oceanographer who was the second author of Roger Revell's 1965 carbon dioxide report for Lyndon Johnson. In 1977, in a presentation at the American Geophysical Union, Broecker predicted that fossil fuels would have to be restricted, whether by taxation or fiat. More recently, he had testified before Congress, calling carbon dioxide the #1 long-term environmental problem. If presidents and senators trusted Broecker to tell them the bad news, he was good enough for Exxon. The company had been studying the carbon dioxide problem for decades, since before it changed its name to Exxon. In 1957, scientists from Humble Oil published a study tracking the enormous quantity of carbon dioxide contributed to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution from the combustion of fossil fuels. Even then, the observation that burning fossil fuels had increased the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere was well understood and accepted by Humble scientists. What was new in 1957 was the effort to quantify what percentage of emissions had been contributed by the oil and gas industry. The American Petroleum Institute, the industry's largest trade association, asked the same question in 1958 through its air pollution study group and replicated the findings made by Humble Oil. So did another API study conducted by the Stanford Research Institute a decade later in 1968, which concluded that the burning of fossil fuels would bring significant temperature changes by the year 2000. And ultimately serious worldwide environmental changes, including the melting of the Antarctic ice cap and rising seas. It was ironic, the study's authors noted, that politicians, regulators, and environmentalists fixated on local incidents of air pollution that were immediately observable, while the climate crisis, whose damage would be of far greater severity and scale, went entirely unheeded. The ritual repeated itself every few years. Industry scientists, at the behest of their corporate bosses, reviewed the problem and found good reasons for alarm and better excuses to do nothing. Why should they act when almost nobody within the United States government, nor for that matter within the environmental movement, seemed worried? Besides, as the National Petroleum Council put it in 1972, changes in the climate would probably not be apparent until at least the turn of the century. The industry had enough urgent crisis. Antitrust legislation introduced by Senator Ted Kennedy, concerns about the health effects of gasoline, battles over the Clean Air Act, and the financial shock of benzene regulation, which increased the cost of every gallon of gas sold in America. Why take on an intractable problem that would not be detected until this generation of employees was safely retired? Worse, the solution seemed more punitive than the problem itself. Historically, energy use had correlated to economic growth. The more fossil fuels we burned, the better our lives became. Why mess with that? Therein lies the rub. Therein lies the reason. The Charney report had changed the industry's cost-benefit calculus. Now there was a formal consensus about the nature of the crisis. As Henry Shaw emphasized in his conversations with Exxon's executives, the cost of inattention would rise in step with the Keeling curve. Wallace Broecker did not think much of one of Exxon's proposals for its new carbon dioxide program, testing the corked air in vintage bottles of French wine to demonstrate how much carbon levels had increased over time. But he did help his colleague, Taro Takahashi, with a more ambitious experiment conducted on board one of Exxon's largest supertankers, the Esso Atlantic, to determine how much carbon the oceans could absorb before coughing it back up into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, the graduate student installed on the tanker botched the job and the data came back a mess. Shaw was running out of time. In 1978, an Exxon colleague circulated an internal memo warning that humankind had only 5 to 10 years before policy action would be necessary. But Congress seemed ready to act a lot sooner than that. On April 3, 1980, Senator Paul Tsongas, remember him, a Massachusetts Democrat, held the first congressional hearing on carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere. George MacDonald testified that the United States should take the initiative and develop, through the United Nations, a way to coordinate every nation's energy policies to address the problem. That June, Jimmy Carter signed the Energy Security Act of 1980, which directed the National Academy of Scientists to start a multi-year comprehensive study to be called Changing Climate that would analyze social and economic effects of climate change. More urgent, the National Commission on Air Quality, at the request of Congress, invited 24 experts, including Henry Shaw himself, to a meeting in Florida to propose climate policy. It seemed that some kind of legislation to restrict carbon combustion was inevitable. The Charney report had confirmed the diagnosis of the problem, a problem that Exxon helped create. Now Exxon would help shape the solution. Oh boy. 5, we are flying blind, October 1980. 2 days before Halloween, Rafe Pomerantz traveled to a cotton candy castle on the Gulf of Mexico near St. Petersburg, Florida, that locals called the Pink Palace. The Don Caesar Hotel was a child's daydream, with cantilevered planes of bubblegum stucco and vanilla white cupolas that appeared to melt in the sunshine like scoops of ice cream. The hotel stood amid blooms of poisonwood and gumbo limbo on a narrow spit of porous limestone that rose no higher than 5 feet above the sea. In its carnival of historical amnesia and childlike faith to the power of fantasy, the Pink Palace was a fine setting for the first rehearsal of a conversation that would be earnestly restaged with little variation and increasing desperation for the next 40 years. In the year and a half since he had read the Cole Report, Pomerantz had attended countless conferences and briefings about the science of global warming, but until now nobody had shown much interest in the subject that he cared about, the only subject that mattered, how to prevent warming. In a sense, he had himself to thank. During the expansion of the Clean Air Act, he pushed for the creation of the National Commission on Air Quality, charged with ensuring that the goals of the act were being met. One such goal was a stable global climate. The Charney Report had made clear that goal was not being met, and now the Commission wanted to hear proposals for legislation. It was a profound responsibility, and the 24 experts invited to the Pink Palace, policy gurus, deep thinkers, and industry scientists, and an environmental activist, had only 3 days to achieve it, but the utopian setting made everything seem possible. The conference room looked better suited to hosting a wedding party than a bureaucratic meeting, its tall window frames framing postcard views of the beach. The sands were blindingly white, the surf was idle, the air unseasonably hot, and the dress code relaxed. Sunglasses and guayaberas, jackets frowned upon. I have a very vested interest in this, said State Representative Tom McPherson, a Florida Democrat, introducing himself to the delegation. Because I own substantial holdings 50 miles inland of the coast, and any beachfront property appreciates in value. There was no formal agenda, just a young moderator from the EPA named Thomas Yorling, and a few handouts left on every seat, including a copy of the Charney Report. Jorling, I think it's Jorling. Jorling acknowledged the vagueness of their mission. We are flying blind with little or no idea where the mountains are, he said, but the stakes couldn't be higher. A failure to recommend policy, he said, would be the same as endorsing the present policy, which was no policy. He asked who wanted to break the ice, not quite appreciating the pun. We might start out with an emotional question, proposed Thomas Waltz, an economist at the National Climate Program. The question is fundamental to being a human being. Do we care? This provoked huffy consternation. In caring or not caring, said John Lorman, a Stanford engineer, I would think the main thing is the timing. It was not an emotional question, in other words, but an economic one. How much did we value the future? We have less time than we realize, said an MIT nuclear engineer named David Rose, who studied how civilizations responded to large technological crises. People leave their problems until the 11th hour, the 59th minute, he said, and then Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. I don't know. That means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? It was a promising beginning, Pomerantz thought. Urgent, detailed, clear-eyed. The attendees seemed to share a sincere interest in finding solutions. They agreed that some kind of international treaty would ultimately be needed to keep atmospheric carbon dioxide at a safe level, but nobody could agree on what that level was. William Elliott, a NOAA scientist, introduced some hard facts. If the United States stopped burning carbon that year, it would delay the arrival of the doubling threshold by only 5 years. Whoa. If Western nations somehow managed to stabilize emissions, it would forestall the inevitable by only 8 years. The only way to avoid the worst was to stop burning coal. Yet China, the Soviet Union, and the United States, by far the world's 3 largest coal producers, were frantically accelerating extraction. Do we have a problem? Asked Anthony Scoville, a congressional science consultant. We do, but it is not the atmospheric problem, it is the political problem. He doubted that any scientific report, no matter how ominous its predictions, would persuade politicians to act. Pomerantz glanced out at the beach, where the occasional tourist dawdled in the surf. Beyond the conference room, few Americans realized that the planet would soon cease to resemble itself. What if the problem was that they were thinking of it as a problem? What I am saying, Scoville continued, is that, in a sense, we are making a transition not only in energy, but the economy as a whole. Even if the coal and oil industries collapsed, renewable technologies like solar energy would take their place. Jimmy Carter was planning to invest $80 billion in synthetic fuel. My God, Scoville said, with $80 billion, you could have a photovoltaics industry going that would obviate the need for synfuels forever. The talk of ending oil production stirred for the first time the gentleman from Exxon. I think there is a transition period, Henry Shaw said. We are not going to stop burning fossil fuels and start looking toward solar or nuclear fusion and so on. We are going to have a very orderly transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. We are talking about some major fights in this country, said Waltz, the economist. We had better start thinking this thing through. But first, lunch. It was a bright day, low 80s, and the group voted to break for 3 hours to enjoy the Florida sun. Pomerantz couldn't. He was restless. He had refrained from speaking, happy to let others lead the discussion, provided it moved in the right direction. But the high-minded talk had soon stalled into fecklessness and pusillanimity. He reflected that he was just about the only participant without an advanced degree, but few of these policy geniuses were showing much sense. They understood what was at stake, and they hadn't taken it to heart. They remained cool, detached, pragmatists overmatched by a problem that had no pragmatic solution or resolution. Prudence, Joling said, is essential. After lunch, Joling tried to focus the conversation. What did they need to know in order to take action? David Slade, who was the director of the Energy Department's $200 million Office of Carbon Dioxide Effects, had probably considered the question more deeply than anyone else in the room. Said he figured that at some point, probably within their lifetimes, they would see the warming themselves. And at that time, Pomerantz bellowed, it will be too late to do anything about it. Yet nobody could agree on what to do. John Perry, a meteorologist who had worked as a staff member on the Charney report, suggested that American energy policy merely take into account the risks of global warming, though he acknowledged that a non-binding measure might seem intolerably stodgy. It was so weak, Pomerantz said, the air seeping out of him, as to not get us anywhere. Reading the indecision in the room, Drolling reversed himself and wondered if it might be best to avoid proposing any specific policy. Let's not load ourselves down with that burden, he said. Let's let others worry. Pomerantz begged Drolling to reconsider. The Commission had asked for hard proposals, but why stop there? Why not propose a new national energy plan? There is no single action that is going to solve the problem, Pomerantz said. You can't keep saying that isn't going to do it, and this isn't going to do it, because then we end up doing nothing. Sound familiar? Scoville, pointing out that the United States was responsible for the largest share of the global carbon emissions, ding, but not for long. If we're going to exercise leadership, he said, the opportunity is now. One way to lead, he proposed, would be to classify carbon dioxide as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act and regulate it as such. This was received by the room like a belch. By Scoville's logic, every sigh was an act of pollution. Did the science really support such an extreme measure? The Charney report did exactly that, Pomerantz said. He was beginning to lose his patience, his civility, his stamina. Now, if everybody wants to sit around and wait until the world warms up, more than it has warmed up since there have been humans around, fine, but I would like to have a shot at avoiding it. Most everybody else seemed content to sit around. Some of the attendees confused uncertainty around the margins of the issue, whether warming would be 3 or 4 degrees Celsius in 50 or 75 years, for an uncertainty about the severity of the problem. As Gordon MacDonald liked to say, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would rise. The only question was, when? The lag between the emissions of gas and the warming it produced could be several decades. It was like adding an extra blanket on a mild night. It took a few minutes before you started to sweat. Yet Slade, the director of the Energy Department's carbon dioxide program, considered the lag a saving grace. If changes did not occur for a decade or more, he said, those in the room couldn't be blamed for failing to prevent them. So what was the problem? You're the problem, Pomerantz said. Because of the lag between cause and effect, it was unlikely that humankind would detect hard evidence of warming until it was too late to reverse it. The lag would doom them. The U.S. has to do something to gain some credibility, he said. So it is a moral stand, Slade replied, sensing an advantage. Call it whatever. Besides, Pomerantz added, they didn't have to ban coal tomorrow. A pair of modest steps could be taken immediately to show the world that the United States was serious. The implementation of a carbon tax and increased investment in renewable energy. Then the United States could organize an international summit meeting to address climate change. This was his closing plea to the group. The next day, they would have to draft policy proposals. When the group reconvened after breakfast, they immediately became stuck on a sentence in their prefatory paragraph declaring that climate changes were likely to occur. Will occur, proposed Lauerman, the Stanford engineer. What about the words highly likely to occur, Scoville asked. Almost sure, said David Rose, the nuclear engineer from MIT. Almost surely, another added. Changes of an undetermined, changes of as yet of a little understood nature, highly or extremely likely to occur, Pomerantz said. Almost surely to occur. No, Pomerantz said. I would like to make one statement, said Anna Marie Crocetti, a public health scholar who sat on the National Commission on Air Quality and had barely spoken all week. I have noticed that very often when we as scientists are cautious in our statements, everybody else misses the point because they don't understand our qualifications. As a non-scientist, said Tony McPherson, the Florida legislator, I really concur. Yet these 24 experts who agreed on the major points and had made a commitment to Congress could not draft a single paragraph. Hours passed in a hell of fruitless negotiation, self-defeating proposals, and impulsive speechifying. Pomerantz and Scoville pushed to include a statement calling for the United States to sharply accelerate international dialogue. But they were sunk by objections and caveats. It was very emotional, Crocetti said, succumbing to her frustration. What we have asked is to get people from different disciplines to come together and tell us what you agree on and what your problems are, and you have only made vague statements. She was interrupted by Waltz, the economist, who wanted simply to note that climate change would have profound effects. Crocetti waited until he exhausted himself before resuming in a calm voice. All I am asking you to say is, we got ourselves a bunch of experts, and by God, they all endorse this point of view and think it is very important. They have disagreements about the details of this and that, but they feel that it behooves us to intervene at this point and try to prevent it. They never got to policy proposals. They never got to the second paragraph. The final statement was signed by only the moderator, who phrased it more weakly than the declaration calling for the workshop in the first place. The guide I would suggest, Jorling wrote, is whether we know enough to recommend changes in existing policy. Pomerantz had seen enough. A consensus-based strategy would not work, could not work without American leadership, and the United States wouldn't act unless a strong leader persuaded it to do so. Someone who would speak with authority about the science, demand action from those in power, and risk everything in pursuit of justice. Pomerantz knew he wasn't that person. He was an organizer, a strategist, a fixer, which meant he was an optimist and even perhaps a romantic. His job was to assemble a movement. And every movement, even one backed by widespread consensus, needed a hero. He just had to find one. Nearing the end of the reading time on this video, I'm going to read a little more, and I'm going to have to come back and hopefully, who even knows if I'm going to finish this in the next video tomorrow. But I hope you all are enjoying listening along to this. Six, otherwise they'll gurgle. November 1980 to September 1981. The meeting ended Friday morning. On Tuesday, 4 days later, Ronald Reagan was elected president. And Rafe Pomerantz soon found himself wondering whether what had seemed to have been a beginning had actually been the end. After the election, Reagan considered plans to close the Energy Department, increase coal production on federal land, and deregulate surface coal mining. Once in office, he appointed James Watt, the president of a legal firm that fought to open public lands to mining and drilling, to run the Interior Department. "We're deliriously happy," the president of the National Coal Association was reported to have said. Reagan preserved the EPA, but named as its administrator Ann Gorsuch, an anti-regulation zealot who proceeded to cut the agency's staff and budget by about a quarter. In the midst of this carnage, the Council on Environmental Quality submitted a report to the White House warning that fossil fuels could permanently and disastrously alter Earth's atmosphere, leading to a warming of the Earth, possibly with very serious effects. Reagan did not act on the Council's advice. Instead, his administration considered eliminating the Council. Wow, so at another crucial point in climate change history, we had the worst possible person become president. As history just repeats itself over and over again. And I'm not even talking about Trump. I'm talking about Reagan and George W. Bush. But it looks like Trump is following in the Reagan mold. At the Pink Palace, Anthony Scoville said that the problem was not atmospheric but political. That was only half right, Pomerantz thought. Behind every political problem, there lay a publicity problem. And the climate crisis had a publicity nightmare. The Florida meeting had failed to prepare a coherent statement, let alone legislation, and now everything was going backward. Even Pomerantz couldn't devote much time to climate change. Friends of the Earth was busier than ever. The campaigns to defeat the nominations of James Watt and Ann Gorsuch were just the beginning. There were also efforts to block mining in wilderness areas, maintain the Clean Air Act standards for air pollutants, and preserve funding for renewable energy. Reagan had declared open war on solar energy, the director of the nation's lead solar energy research agency said, after he was asked to resign. Reagan appeared determined to reverse the environmental achievements of Jimmy Carter before undoing those of Richard Nixon, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, and if he could get away with it, Theodore Roosevelt. Reagan's violence to environmental regulations alarmed even members of his own party. Senator Robert Stafford, a Vermont Republican and chairman of the committee that held confirmation hearings on Gorsuch, took the unusual step of lecturing her from the dais about her moral obligation to protect the nation's air and water. Watt's plan to open the waters off California for oil drilling was denounced by the state's Republican senator, and Reagan's proposal to eliminate the position of science advisor was roundly derided by the scientists and engineers who advised him during his presidential campaign. When Reagan considered closing the Council on Environmental Quality, its acting chairman, Malcolm Forbes Baldwin, wrote to the vice president and the White House chief of staff begging them to reconsider. In a major speech the same week, a conservatives program for the environment, Baldwin argued that it was time for today's conservatives explicitly to embrace environmentalism. Environmental protection was not only good sense, it was good business. What could be more conservative than an efficient use of resources that led to fewer federal subsidies? Meanwhile, the Charney report continued to vibrate at the periphery of public consciousness. Its conclusions were confirmed by major studies from the Aspen Institute, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis near Vienna, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Every month or so, nationally syndicated articles appeared summoning apocalypse, another warning on greenhouse effect, global warming trend beyond human experience, warming trend could pit nation against nation. People magazine had profiled Gordon MacDonald, photographing him standing on the steps of the Capitol and pointing above his head to the level the water would reach when the polar ice caps melted. If Gordon MacDonald is wrong, they'll laugh, the article read. Otherwise, they'll gurgle. They'll gurgle. All right, I've reached the limit of time at which this video can actually proceed. I'm at 44 minutes and I probably maybe another minute or two over that. Hope you've enjoyed this. I will come back again tomorrow and hopefully finish this article. Thank you all for your eyes, your ears, and your conscience. If you would like to support this channel, you can do so at the links below. Until tomorrow, peace.